In 1966, Ranger, Texas was a small town with only about 3,000 people. It had been in a slow but steady decline since the 1920s and the end of the oil boom era. 44 kids graduated from high school that year. 11 of them went to Vietnam, 25%. Similar numbers joined or were drafted in the years before and after 1966. In this aspect, Ranger was a typical American town. At first glance, the years after Vietnam seemed typical too. The men came home somewhat damaged and attempted to get on with their lives. Some were more successful than others. Then, in August 2003, David Dunson committed suicide. Graduates of the class of '66 gathered to pay their respects. Statistically, David was one of 6,000 veterans to commit suicide that year and one of 16 that day. Veteran or not, combat or not, PTSD affected everyone in the class of '66. Many had not been home since their Vietnam days. Some were coping better than others, but maturity enabled them to have conversations they could not have had at 19. A lot of the conversations in Ranger that week were about PTSD. By 2003, PTSD had been in the news for years, reducing the taboo against admitting stress and seeking treatment. The general social view was slowly changing to acknowledge that emotional issues were common and acceptable. At the VA, many changes had been made in awareness and treatment for all veterans. As the stigma was reduced and programs developed, the number of people asking for help increased. This was important in 2003 because David Dunson was not the only veteran in Ranger, Texas having difficulties. As people visited and got to know each other again, a lot of the talk was about Larry Monroe. Larry seemed to have come home angry, and it really hadn't gotten any better. He was known around Ranger for drinking too much and picking fights. He hadn't held a steady job in his life. One veteran that came to town for the funeral was Joel Jimenez. He had recently started working as a Veterans Service Provider in Wichita Falls. There's a VSO, Veterans Service Office, in every county whose job it is to help veterans navigate the route to benefits and treatment. Most are volunteer positions. The result of that is usually a veteran who cares but has little more knowledge or skills than the veteran he's trying to help. Joel was not nearly as experienced as he would become over the years, but he had some training, and most importantly, he cared. Joel has his own PTSD issues, but had recognized them and started working them out earlier. I'm going to pause here for a brief aside about medical and mental health care for veterans. It is a confusing quagmire of contradictory policies and obscure information. While changes were happening in 2003, there were still a lot of problems. Well, they still are today. As an example, this is the sign-in page for va.gov. Every one of those four provides something different, and none have the same type of login. That DS login took me 6 months to set up while I tracked down the personal information it was looking for to verify my identity, things like a house number where I lived 30 years ago. Until the 2018 passage of the Mission Act, there was no way for veterans to receive medical or mental health care in their communities. In 2003, veterans of Eastland County had two options, which is more than a lot of places had. Eastland happened to be centered somewhat between the VA hospitals in Temple and Big Spring. Each is a 3-hour drive, but you could pick your poison. Wichita Falls, Texas, where Joel lived, was part of the Oklahoma City hospital system. As a veteran, I know that sometimes just thinking about how hard it is to get care is exhausting, and it is easier to put it off than to fight the system. Rural veterans especially feel this because of the distances involved. It can take an entire day for something you could do on your lunch break if services were available at home. To this add that the veterans most in need of help are often the ones with unreliable transportation. Okay, back to business. Larry Monroe is at a place in his life where he is ready to receive help, and Joel Jimenez is in a position to help. They put together the paperwork necessary to get Larry into the VA system so he can start receiving treatment. And in November of 2003, Joelle drove Larry the 3 hours to Big Spring for evaluation. In the smallest of worlds, they are shown into the office of Dr. David Sutton, a Ranger High School class of 1964 graduate. With his friends and community surrounding him, Larry starts the VA side of the process. Of course, just getting into the system is not the only problem. Traveling for hours for treatment is challenging for most people, especially if it is necessary multiple times per month or even week. Community resources are necessary, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Two important things happened locally for Larry and Joelle. The first was a PTSD counseling program. The second was the idea of the Vietnam Memorial. As they were leaving the VA hospital in Big Spring, they paused to look at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial there. During the 3-hour trip home, they talked about the memorial, taking it from acknowledgement of its existence to a pretty well-developed plan of action for the creation of something similar in their hometown. It turned out that the class of '66 had some pretty far-reaching ties, just waiting for outgoing social networking men like Larry and Joelle to reach out and ask for help. Mac Jacoby, a local luminary, became the webmaster, setting up a site to receive donations. Mac also did a lot of legwork, identifying which veterans should be honored on the memorial and tracking down them or their families to collect donations. They received a monetary contribution from everyone on the list of veterans. Jack Waddington worked for the White House. He helped with protocol and making sure it was all done right. There were quite a few other contributors on the committee who are named on the back of the memorial. Joelle worked on federal and state aspects, while Larry worked on the local and county aspects. Anyone who has ever worked within the budgets of a local government knows how challenging that can be. Larry went to the city council asking for a specific piece of land. It had been designated a city park, but it had not been developed. It turned out that the city did not own the land, but through some convoluted machinations, they were able to transfer the land from the state to the city. From there, it was granted to the Veterans Group, who assumed responsibility for its maintenance. The chosen piece of parkland is across the creek from another park developed by the WPA. After World War II, it was dedicated to all veterans. That park is what is today considered the Veterans Park in a generic kind of way. The park on the east side of the creek is specifically the Ranger Vietnam Veterans Park. It houses the memorial and is the location for many annual events. Current plans include a bridge over the creek to connect the two parks and a walking path. By combining the two parks, we have a 1-mile route. We are taking donations for that if you're interested. So the land is acquired, a committee is formed, and with the Lions Club supporting the effort by providing tax and banking information, the collection of donations and contributions begins in earnest. Larry Monroe finally had a purpose, but it was far more than building a memorial. After seeking and receiving treatment, the next thing was realizing that getting help in Big Spring or even Abilene is unreasonable. For the unemployed, it is financially impossible to make trips multiple times per week. For the employed, taking the necessary time off has repercussions in the workplace. Other veterans were starting to notice Larry's work and ask questions about having local meetings. Larry and Joelle looked for a way to bring their counseling home. They first reached out to the director of the Fort Worth Veterans Center. His only concern was that they had an appropriate facility to meet in. Larry had become the commander of the VFW post in Eastland, and it was a natural place. The Fort Worth Center began sending a counselor twice a month. That counselor now comes from Abilene, and the location has changed to the old Boy Scout hut in Ranger, but veterans of all wars now receive PTSD help in Eastland County twice a month, every other Tuesday at 10 if you want to attend. The weather has been nice enough lately that the last few meetings have been at the park. This is about much more than PTSD counseling. Veterans are entitled to a variety of benefits, including educational, financial, and physical health. Today, the military is better about providing information to veterans on discharge than it was 50 years ago when these guys got out. But sometimes it can be challenging to access benefits even when you do know what you are entitled to. When you don't know, it never happens. Early on, Larry noticed that there were not very many disabled veterans' license plates on cars around the county. This means one of two things. Either people were not getting plates or they were not getting categorized as disabled veterans. One is a lot bigger problem than the other. They decided to hold a seminar at the VFW in Eastland to help veterans get into the system. They coordinated all those veteran service officers I mentioned earlier from all around the region and were able to set up a dozen stations where veterans could apply for benefits. 250 veterans showed up, and one at a time they were helped to submit their documentation to the VA. Larry said there were a lot of DV tags after that. They did it again in 2007, helping another 150 veterans. So let's talk about the park itself. It is the setting for the sacred stone, which I was told time and again is far more than a memorial. The building of it was a form of catharsis, giving identity back to those involved. Decisions, such as the color of the stone, were made based on this catharsis. Black stone was chosen on purpose to reflect the darkness of the events and bring the darkness into light. After collecting donations for about a year, enough money was gathered to build not only the memorial, but to create many park utility items, such as 2 covered picnic areas with barbecue cookers, restrooms, 2 swing sets, flagpoles and flags, an outbuilding for storage. They have so many chairs. Even a 16-foot trailer and sound system. Speeches can be made from any part of the park. Enough gravel was donated to construct a road through the park, and electricity was run to the outbuildings and shelters. Today, volunteers perform most of the maintenance as well as provide donations for cookouts, parties, and the utility bills. As you might expect, sometimes we have hot dogs and other times we have brisket, depending on the economy. Either way, we hold at least 3 events every year: Vietnam Veterans Day, 4th of July, and Veterans Day. Vietnam Veterans Day is March 29th, about a week ago. Some of these pictures are from the event we held that day. Happily, it was a brisket day. All their hard work paid off on August 4th, 2007, with the dedication of the sacred stone. It was a spectacular event. Networking at high levels of the U.S. government yielded results far beyond what an ordinary small town could expect. In attendance were Colonel, soon-to-be General David Norsworthy from Dyess Air Force Base, as well as Lieutenant General Richard Carey of the Marines, and 2 survivors of the USS Indianapolis. Letters arrived from President George Bush and Governor Rick Perry, honoring the sacred stone and the Ranger Vietnam veterans. The guest of honor was Virgie Rogers, mother of Larry Joe Rogers, the only Rangerite lost during the war. She continued to attend events at the park until her death in 2020. The entire thing kicked off with a parade through Ranger that included the Patriot Guard riders and a traveling Liberty Bell. They even delayed the Burlington Northern so the parade could cross the tracks. A very special part of the ceremony included a purification of the stone in a Native American smudging ceremony. The ceremony was conducted by Vietnam veterans David Mojica of the Laguna Pueblo Nation and Orlando Souza of the Comanche Apache Nation. In the ceremony, small plants are burned to create smoke, which is fanned over the stone with an eagle feather. The ashes were buried at the base of the stone. After unveiling the highway sign for the park, local judge Rex Fields and the regional VA director Carl Lowe spoke. Their presentations were accented by excellently timed flyovers, first of 2 Talon 38 jets out of Shepherd Air Force Base, and then of Apache helicopters from Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos. The flyovers were said to shake the entire area. Joel Jimenez called it the sound of freedom. The current PTSD group is a testament to Larry and Joel. Larry Monroe was a sadly typical Vietnam vet. He came home angry and confused about what was supposed to come next. He turned to alcohol to wash his troubles away. It took decades for him to reach a place where he could make positive changes, stop drinking, and develop new relationships. The memorial was a key part of that. 40 years after returning, he found family and a purpose. Today, he is the go-to guy for everything veteran in Ranger and Eastland County. He coordinates all the activities of the Ranger Veteran Support Group. One area he excels at is funerals. Every veteran is entitled to a military funeral, whether they are buried in a military cemetery or not. Funeral homes in multiple counties have Larry on speed dial. He can pull together 8 or 10 veterans on an hour's notice and guarantee there is appropriate representation. Joel Jimenez has been the commander of Chapter 41 of the Disabled American Veterans Association in Wichita Falls for decades. He comes to Ranger for almost all of our events. Where Larry has the local connections, Joel has the national connections and the outgoing personality to engage strangers and ask for money. When these two men were attending high school in Ranger, Texas in 1966, they had no idea what the future had in store for them and how they would come together 40 years later. These two men took what started as a casual conversation during a road trip and turned it into a tangible, community-valued site that is regularly used. But even more importantly, it acted as a cathartic exercise, providing a sense of self and peace of mind to the developers and the users. These current members can attest to its value.